Imagine packing up your life, leaving behind everything you know, and making a dangerous journey to a new country. All in search of a better future. What drives people to take such risks? Which countries are sending the most migrants to the US and why? From escaping violence to seeking better economic opportunities, each story is unique. In this video, we'll explore the top countries sending illegal immigrants to the US and uncover the real reasons behind their journey. Number 10. Cuba. You know, Cuba's relationship with the US has always been, well, complicated. But despite the political tension, Cubans have been making their way to the US for decades. And no, it's not always through the fancy legal channels. Many Cubans still attempt to come to the US without papers, driven by the harsh economic conditions and political restrictions back home. In fact, according to the US Customs and Border Protection (CBP), over 60,000 Cuban migrants were encountered at the US-Mexico border in 2024 alone. That's a pretty hefty number when you think about how small Cuba is compared to other countries. But you see, the thing is, there's something unique about Cuban migration policies. Thanks to the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, Cubans who make it to US soil, no matter how they got there, can apply for legal permanent residency after 1 year. So yeah, if they make it, they've got a pretty sweet deal waiting for them. But let's not sugarcoat it. Getting there isn't easy. Most Cubans either make dangerous boat trips or try to cross through Central America, risking it all. They're fleeing not just poverty but also strict political oppression. Since the Cuban government controls most aspects of life, from the economy to free speech, many are just looking for a life where they can express themselves without fear of punishment. Fun fact: since 2015, the number of Cuban migrants has actually doubled each year, especially after the US loosened its immigration policies under President Obama. But even with that shift, things are still tough back home, so Cuba remains a steady contributor to illegal immigration. Number 9. Vietnam. You probably already know that Vietnam has a long and complicated history with the United States, especially considering the war that took place in the 1960s and 70s. Fast forward to today, though, and you'll find that Vietnam continues to be one of the significant sources of illegal immigration into the US. But here's the twist. Most Vietnamese immigrants aren't crossing the border or braving boats. A large portion of them come on legal visas and then bam, they overstay, which technically makes them illegal. Here's an interesting nugget. There are over 2 million Vietnamese Americans in the US as of 2024, with a significant portion of them born in Vietnam. So how does this tie into illegal immigration? Well, many Vietnamese immigrants who first arrived as refugees during and after the Vietnam War in the 1970s are still sending back home for relatives. According to the Migration Policy Institute, a large number of Vietnamese nationals enter the US on temporary work or student visas, but once they're here, they don't always leave. Some estimates say that there are about 100,000 Vietnamese immigrants who are living in the US illegally, many of whom came for better economic opportunities or to reunite with family members. But here's the kicker. Vietnamese illegal immigrants aren't just looking for a better life, they're also trying to escape issues back home, like limited economic opportunities and political repression. After all, Vietnam is a one-party state, and although it has made economic strides, there's still a lot of censorship, control, and poverty that pushes people to seek better opportunities abroad. Did you know that Vietnamese immigrants in the US have one of the highest rates of business ownership? They're well known for their small businesses, especially in the restaurant industry, and it's incredible to see how they've built strong, thriving communities. So while a good number of Vietnamese immigrants enter the US illegally, they're also an important part of the American fabric, working hard to make a life for themselves. Number 8. Ecuador. This little country on the Pacific coast of South America may not be as big as its neighbor, but it sends a significant number of migrants north every year, and many of them end up in the US illegally. Ecuadorians are mostly driven by the pursuit of economic opportunity and the desire for a better life. In fact, Ecuador has one of the highest immigration rates in Latin America, with millions of its citizens living abroad, particularly in the US. So what's causing this outflow? Ecuador has struggled with political instability, economic inequality, and a lack of jobs, especially in rural areas. About 25% of the population lives below the poverty line, and there's a huge gap between the rich and poor. With the US being just a short plane ride away, many Ecuadorians see it as the land of opportunity. According to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, there were nearly 200,000 Ecuadorian nationals in the U.S. illegally as of the latest estimates, though many Ecuadorians also arrive legally and then overstay their visas. It's interesting to note that the migration patterns from Ecuador have been steadily increasing since the late 1990s, especially during times of economic crisis. The 1999 banking crisis, for example, caused widespread unemployment and led to thousands of Ecuadorians seeking a way out. While many travel through Mexico and Central America, others fly directly to the US and then overstay their visas. A lot of Ecuadorians are coming to the US in search of better wages, and some find jobs in industries like construction, agriculture, and hospitality. Ecuadorians are known for their strong sense of community, and that's exactly what they build when they get to the US. They often settle in cities like New York, Queens, and Los Angeles, where there are thriving Ecuadorian neighborhoods. So even though they're a smaller group compared to other Latin American migrants, Ecuadorians play an outsized role in the U.S. economy and culture. Number 7. Brazil. This giant of a country has been producing some seriously high numbers when it comes to illegal immigration to the U.S. In fact, there was a major surge in Brazilian migrants after 2014, with numbers climbing dramatically. According to U.S. border officials, the number of Brazilian nationals encountered at the U.S.-Mexico border more than quadrupled in recent years, reaching over 35,000 in 2024 alone. Why are so many Brazilians trying to cross into the U.S. illegally? Well, Brazil's economy has had its ups and downs. While it's the largest economy in South America, it's also plagued by inequality, political corruption, and high unemployment rates. In fact, 1 in 5 Brazilians live in poverty, which is a huge motivator for many to seek opportunities elsewhere. Plus, there's also the fact that the U.S. has such a strong Brazilian community. Many Brazilians who have already migrated legally serve as support for those who are trying to enter the U.S. illegally, whether it's by helping with visa overstays or guiding them through dangerous border crossings. Brazilians aren't just coming to the U.S. for work, they're also fleeing violence in certain regions, especially in the favelas, slums, of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Many of them are escaping gang violence and economic hardship in search of safety and a better future in the U.S. They often find jobs in construction, agriculture, and service industries. One fun fact: in certain parts of the U.S., like New Jersey, you'll find an incredibly strong Brazilian community, complete with Brazilian restaurants, shops, and even schools. They've really built their own little Brazil within the U.S., creating a unique cultural fusion that's thriving in places where they've settled. Number 6. China. China is a bit of an interesting case when it comes to illegal immigration to the U.S. Unlike many other countries on this list, a lot of illegal immigration from China happens in a very specific way, through visa overstays. Many Chinese nationals come to the U.S. on student or work visas and then simply don't leave when their visas expire. As of recent estimates, over 100,000 Chinese immigrants are living in the U.S. illegally, and that number is growing every year. But it's not just about overstaying visas. Some Chinese nationals enter the U.S. illegally via human trafficking networks or by paying smugglers to get them across the border. The reason for this illegal migration is straightforward: opportunity. The U.S. is a land of big dreams, and for many Chinese, it's about getting access to better education, career prospects, and a higher standard of living. But there's also a bit of political push under China's authoritarian regime. Individuals seeking more freedom, like dissidents or those critical of the government, sometimes see the U.S. as a sanctuary. Interestingly, there's also a significant portion of Chinese immigrants who enter the U.S. legally and then, once here, decide to overstay or adjust their status by other means. Some even enter on tourist visas and never return home, creating a growing population of undocumented Chinese in the U.S. Fun fact: New York has one of the largest Chinese immigrant populations, with over 500,000 Chinese Americans living there. So it's no surprise that the U.S. continues to see high levels of Chinese immigration, both legal and illegal. Number 5. India. One of the world's most populous and dynamic countries, India is not only a major source of legal immigration to the US but also one of the top countries contributing to illegal immigration. Now, the illegal side often comes from individuals who overstay their visas. A lot of Indians come to the US legally for work, education, or family reunification, but as we all know, life doesn't always go as planned. Over 300,000 Indians enter the US on work and student visas each year, and many stay beyond the allowed time. Why is India so high on the list? First, the economic opportunity in the US is a massive draw for Indians, especially in industries like technology, engineering, and medicine. India produces more than 1.5 million engineering graduates every year, and a lot of them dream of landing big tech jobs in Silicon Valley or other major cities. Some of them might come on an H-1B visa, a work visa which allows them to stay temporarily, but here's the thing. Many overstay their visas, hoping to switch jobs or find ways to stay longer, which turns them into undocumented immigrants. Another factor is the family reunification system. Many Indian immigrants who came legally have family members waiting back home, so they might try to bring their relatives to the US, but if they don't go through the proper legal channels, things can go sideways quickly. This family connection system creates a whole network of people migrating, even if some do it illegally. Here's the kicker. India has the second largest number of undocumented immigrants in the US after Mexico, with estimates showing around 200,000 to 300,000 people from India living in the US without authorization, and the number keeps rising. Many of them settle in major cities like New York, San Francisco, and Chicago, where there's a huge Indian community and a solid support system. But there's one more thing. Indian immigration isn't just about tech jobs or overstaying visas. Many are fleeing economic challenges such as poverty, inequality, and a lack of opportunities in rural areas and see the US as the land of unlimited potential. Number 4. El Salvador. A country in Central America that's unfortunately become synonymous with gang violence, poverty, and instability. While it's a small country with just about 6 million people, El Salvador consistently ranks as one of the top sources of illegal immigration to the US, and for good reason. For many Salvadorans, escaping violence and finding a better life is the driving force behind their migration. Here's what's going on. El Salvador has faced decades of violence, much of it driven by powerful gang organizations. The infamous MS-13 and 18th Street gangs have wreaked havoc on the country, and as a result, El Salvador has one of the highest murder rates in the world. In fact, the homicide rate in El Salvador is more than 50 per 100,000 people, one of the highest in Latin America. When your day-to-day life involves dodging bullets, it's hard to stay in one place and survive. Many Salvadorans make the perilous journey north, hoping to reach the US and find safety for themselves and their families. The violence is paired with economic hardship. El Salvador has one of the highest poverty rates in Latin America, with around 30% of the population living below the poverty line. The country's economy has struggled to provide jobs, especially for the youth, who often see joining a gang as their only way out. As a result, the US has become a prime destination as it represents not only physical safety but also the possibility of earning a stable income and securing a future. In fact, around 1.5 million Salvadorans live in the US today, and of those, a significant portion entered illegally. The journey is often treacherous, with many migrants passing through Mexico and facing extreme risks along the way. It's estimated that about 100,000 Salvadorans were encountered at the US border in 2024 alone. Here's the kicker. El Salvador is not just sending migrants because of violence. There's also a huge family reunification factor. Many Salvadorans have already established lives in the US and are trying to reunite with relatives. This has made El Salvador one of the largest contributors to illegal immigration in Central America. Number 3. Honduras. Another Central American nation that faces a similar set of challenges as El Salvador and Guatemala. Honduras has been sending waves of migrants to the US for years, driven primarily by violence, economic instability, and a lack of opportunities. If you look at the numbers, you'll see why. In 2024, Honduras ranked among the top 5 countries contributing to illegal immigration, with an estimated 30,000 Hondurans encountered at the U.S. southern border alone. Let's talk about the main drivers. Violence in Honduras is a huge issue. Gangs like MS-13 and the Barrio 18 have taken control of large parts of the country, terrorizing local communities. The violence is often so intense that it forces families to leave everything behind and embark on a dangerous journey to the U.S. You might be thinking, why not just stay in nearby countries? But here's the thing. Many Hondurans don't just migrate for safety, they do it for a better future. The economy is tough, with around 60% of the population living in poverty, and many young people can't find stable jobs. As a result, migration becomes the best option. Additionally, the agriculture sector in Honduras is heavily reliant on coffee, and with climate change wreaking havoc on crops, many farmers are struggling. This environmental stress, combined with social instability, creates a perfect storm that pushes people to seek a new life northward. Family reunification also plays a big role here too. With so many Hondurans already living in the U.S., many are trying to reunite with relatives who have been living there for years. This growing community of Honduran nationals in the U.S. supports the flow of people coming north. But here's the reality, the journey isn't easy. Hondurans face extreme dangers traveling through Mexico, from cartels and human traffickers to the harsh elements of the journey. But despite the risks, the pull of the U.S. remains too strong. Many Hondurans believe that once they reach the U.S., they can start fresh and build a future they can't find back home. Number 2. Guatemala. A country that's at the heart of Central America and has one of the highest rates of immigration in the world. In fact, Guatemala's population is just over 18 million, but the country has sent more than 1.5 million people to the U.S. over the years. Much like its neighbors, Honduras and El Salvador, Guatemala is facing a mix of economic struggles, gang violence, and political instability that drives many people to make the dangerous trek to the U.S. So why is Guatemala so high on the list? Economic inequality is a huge factor. Around 60% of Guatemalans live in poverty, and the country has one of the highest rates of child malnutrition in the world. The agricultural sector, which employs a large portion of the population, has suffered due to climate change, with crop failures and dwindling profits forcing many farmers into despair. Add to that the violence from powerful gangs and organized crime, and it's easy to see why so many Guatemalans are fleeing. In 2024 alone, over 80,000 Guatemalans were encountered at the U.S. southern border. The people who make this journey are often seeking better economic opportunities, but for many, the biggest motivator is safety. Gang violence and domestic abuse are rampant, and when your life is constantly at risk, it's not easy to stay put. Many see the U.S. as the land of opportunity, where they can work hard, earn money, and send it back to their families. Family reunification also plays a huge role in Guatemala's migration patterns. Many Guatemalans already have family members who've moved to the U.S., which creates a cycle of migration. Once one family member crosses, others follow. And while many Guatemalans enter the U.S. illegally, they often have close-knit communities waiting to help them get settled. While the journey is tough and fraught with danger, the desire to escape violence and poverty keeps the flow of Guatemalan immigrants steady. The U.S. remains a beacon of hope for those who can make it, and despite the risks, many believe it's worth the chance to start anew. Number 1. Mexico. The country that has historically been and still is the largest source of illegal immigration to the U.S. and let's face it, when it comes to the U.S.-Mexico border, the numbers are staggering. In 2024 alone, more than 500,000 Mexican nationals were encountered at the border, making up nearly half of all encounters that year. But why is Mexico at the top of the list? It all boils down to proximity, economic inequality, and family ties. Mexico shares a 2,000-mile border with the U.S., making it the most natural point of entry for migrants seeking a better life. The U.S. is just a short hop across the border, and for many Mexicans, it's been a long-standing tradition to head north in search of work, better opportunities, or safety. In fact, over 11 million Mexican-born individuals live in the U.S., many of whom crossed the border illegally at some point. But here's the thing. The numbers have been changing. While illegal immigration from Mexico has dropped significantly over the last decade, it's still a major issue. Mexico's economy has improved, but it still faces challenges like poverty, corruption, and violence. In 2024, 36% of Mexicans were living in poverty, which often pushes people to seek a better life in the U.S. Many Mexican migrants come looking for work in agriculture, construction, and hospitality, where jobs are abundant but often require people to enter the U.S. without legal documentation. Family reunification is also a huge factor. Many Mexicans who've already made it to the U.S. want to bring their relatives over, and often the only way to do so is by entering illegally. Despite stricter immigration policies in recent years, the pull of the U.S. is still incredibly strong, and for many Mexicans, crossing the border is still seen as the best way to secure a better future.